In the 12 years since 9/11, Al-Qaeda continues inspiring numerous acts of terror. It does so with a sophisticated information campaign. Messages are spread online using sites like YouTube. So far, law enforcement in the United States is unable to find a way to respond. But that's not the case in Britain. Our senior correspondent, John Miller, is a former deputy director of national intelligence. John, good morning. You've been talking a lot about this.
So, Nora, going back before 9/11, radicalization was an up-close and personal thing. A recruit was identified and groomed and taken to a camp and trained. Today, much of radicalization is global, done through sophisticated propaganda videos in the darkest corners of the internet. So what is the strategy to counter that? I went to London and Manchester recently to look at what they're doing differently over there. In the Boston Marathon bombing, the FBI says much of the bomber's inspiration came from Anwar al-Awlaki, the late senior recruiter for al-Qaeda, whose message is spread across YouTube in dozens of videos.
To the American people, I say, your security will continue to be threatened as long as your government continues with its aggression against the Muslim people.
I think al-Awlaki realized that he could build up a cult following and then gather entire chunks of people in that direction.
Maajid Nawaz is a British citizen and former radical. He says 12 years after the September 11th attacks, governments have failed to create a counter-narrative that is as powerful to young, disaffected youth as the messages of Anwar al-Awlaki or Osama bin Laden.
I had absolutely no empathy for the suffering in the United States.
Nawaz was arrested in Egypt and he says tortured for plotting to topple the government there. Today, Nawaz says he was taken in by a narrative that is built from what he calls cleverly arranged half-truths.
To add these half-truths up and to conclude that there's a global war against Islam is what leads to the young radical reaching a state where his or her heart is completely hardened and closed off to anyone other than Muslim suffering.
And that, Nawaz says, becomes the justification for this.
Something just blew up. Run!
In his new book, Radical, Nawaz charts his own path from radicalization to rejection.
Since then, I've visited Ground Zero, I've spoken at the 9/11 memorial, and I've changed my views on all of this. But
Nawaz may be the anti-Awlaki.
Why are we busy making excuses for the terrorists? Why don't we protest against the terrorists like we protest against America? Is it not also a crime when Muslims are killing Muslims?
He argues for smarter messaging to fight the romanticized notions of violent jihad as an adventure.
We don't have a Coca-Cola to their Pepsi.
Nawaz grew up and became radicalized in Great Britain, and that country is ahead of other Western nations in its attempt to reach out to Muslim youth. We went to Manchester, England, to see how police there are working to identify young people at risk.
And I can understand that.
Manchester Police Chief Constable Peter Fahey heads that program.
It's about our reach into local communities, that we know what's going on.
Plainclothes officers like Daryl Cunningham and Oz Khan work their contacts in neighborhoods with ties to nations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia.
We're not there to identify sources of information, but we are there to take their concerns back.
And when the community identifies a person who may be headed down the path of radicalization or violence, police look at their options. Do they make an arrest, or do they find another approach? How do you evaluate that?
Number one, if it's crossed, the divide into conduct which is clearly criminal. Is this a vulnerable person who perhaps has been radicalized? Is this a person who is capable of rescue?
First one here,
Maajid Nawaz has an even broader vision.
To challenge extremism and to advocate for democratic values. To simply focus on renegotiating the social contract so that the young people can believe in certain core principles of human rights and democracy.
So this was an interesting contrast from, they have a strategy that's broken into pieces. This part is the prevent piece, and that part where they divert people into programs is called channel, obviously to channel them away from radicalization. It's a little more advanced than anything we're doing here.
It's such a fundamental and basic idea. You've got to be a participant in the battle of ideas. You've got to be Coke to their Pepsi. I mean, why?
So there's a key reason for that disconnect, which is government is just about the worst messenger. Remember, this is a battle for hearts and minds that has a religious overlay. And when the message is being formulated from government, it's one thing to have a campaign that say, just say no to drugs. But if you're going to start to interpret things through people's religions, government can't formulate that message. And we haven't really found that person with charisma and outreach, the American anti-Alaki, if you will.
But have we looked?
Okay, this is where it gets messy. I sat in the White House Situation Room meetings with the, Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. That's what Nawaz says. This was death by committee. They made a lot of paper, had a lot of meetings, but they never came up with anything. And part of the problem is politics, which is if you're going to find somebody whose voice resonates to that demographic, you've got to find somebody who can reach the same people who may disagree with U.S. policy.
Right.
And basically, when you get to that, the politicians say, we can't support or fund somebody who says bad things about the government, and then the whole discussion starts over.
Yeah, largely in the past, it was goodwill ambassadors that were high-ranking officials in the government who were sent overseas who, as you point, may not have resonated with that group. Great story, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks.